Well, good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm chapter 72. I'd like to introduce the psalm by what Paul had said in First Timothy chapter 2, where Paul encourages us to pray for leadership. And here's what Paul said: I exhort you, therefore, first of all, that supplications, prayers, and intercessions and giving thanks be made for all men. Now, notice this: for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceful life. Now, in Psalm chapter 72, there is this petition, and it's interesting because you have to decide, and maybe you decide whether the king is asking God for that he might rule with wisdom and righteousness, or is it the people that are asking for that? I suppose in some ways it's not that important that the king is asking or the people desire a king like that. If you look at the history of the leadership in Israel, most oftentimes it was corrupt and people were intoxicated with power, and oftentimes they didn't care about the people at all. And so the list is long with evil rulers who really distorted the truth and were looking only out for themselves. And so it's an interesting thing. Let's go ahead and look at it, and I think that you'll see that in Psalm chapter 72. Now, in verse number 1, give the king thy judgments, O God, and display righteousness unto the king's son. Now, you'll remember back in 1 Kings chapter 3, this was what Solomon was asking for himself, that he might have the wisdom and use righteousness as the rule. Now, it's important to think about this, that if I were to ask you what made America great, I suppose historians would give you all kinds of different answers, and they may not even think about how America was a righteous nation, and that the leadership by godly men was interested in about justice for the people, regardless of who they were. That is, without partiality and favoritism. But what you see has time moved on, that even in our own nation, the leaders are not looked upon as men who are righteous. We've had some very, very good leaders, and so did Israel. They had a few good leaders. You can think of Hezekiah, and even David was a just king. But for the most part, what you saw in the nation of Israel was that the leaders were corrupt and self-serving. And what the psalmist is asking in here is that give me righteousness that I might judge the people in the right way. Let's go ahead here. He shall judge the people with righteousness, and you're going to see this emphasized over and over again in the psalm if you look at it, because if you judge with righteousness and you're fair with the people and you care about the people, then he'll go on to talk about how the nation will prosper. And usually we think of economy as the key to prosperity as we look at the world from a mundane perspective. But what really makes a nation great is how, if it's a nation of morality and justice and goodness, and that's the thing that needs to be retrieved so oftentimes. Every time we pick up a newspaper or listen to the media, we're bombarded with all the kind of bad stuff about leadership in the nation. And we cry out that that those that are in leadership would go back to God. Now, Jimmy Carter probably is never going to make the list of one of the great presidents of the United States. There's a lot of things that we could talk about there, but one thing about old Jimmy Carter was that he was a godly man, and he wanted to do things that were right. And it's important for us to consider this. Look, go ahead here and read. He shall judge the people with righteousness and the poor with judgment, or again, understand the idea of righteousness. And so you see that oftentimes people without power were oppressed, and the poor in particular. You could oppress the poor, and a lot of times they were taken advantage of, and they just didn't get any justice. That's the whole point in Luke chapter 18, where you recall that Jesus talks about a judge who did not care about God, nor did he he didn't care about the folks. And because of that, the widow didn't receive justice. And so we're trying to emphasize, as we're thinking about this particular psalm, that what I think that made America great was when we were on the horizon of goodness and morality. And when we stepped aside from that, we've always find ourselves in trouble, because you see the corruption pervades in so many different ways. And so here he goes on to say here, he shall judge the people with righteousness. If I go down to verse 3, again, you see righteousness. In verse 4, he'll judge the poor of the people and the children of the needy, and he'll say, break in pieces of the oppressors, because again, the oppressors would take advantage of the poor, and they didn't get justice because they were poor. It was the people who were rich and who were in power. And by the way, as I was thinking about this particular psalm, it just reminded me about the devil, who was intoxicated with power. He even wants Jesus to bow down. You realize he didn't care about all the stuff that was out there. He said, I'd give you the rest of the world if you just bow down to me. The devil, what made the devil was he was intoxicated with power. That's what he wanted. And that's a sad thing when leadership is just interested in power, because as the old saying goes, power corrupts. And so what you see in the psalm, and we ought to think about it perhaps on an individual level, that we ought to be fair and just and act without favoritism. Now, the psalm is oftentimes referred to as a messianic psalm because of the following verses down in verse 17 and following. But let me just say something about the person who is a righteous and just judge, who cannot be corrupted, who is always fair, who always does what's right. If you look in this particular psalm, you're going to see that he's going to be honored by the people. He's going to be upheld by the people. And he'll go on to say in the messianic terms, as you look down in verse 17, his name shall endure forever. His name shall be continued as long as the sun, and men shall be blessed in him, and all the nations of the world. As you think about if this indeed is a messianic psalm, which most scholars do believe that it is, can you imagine just for a moment that living in a time, and that time will come when the kingdom of God is completely revealed, and as we are in God's eternal kingdom, that it'll be perfect, it will be just, there will be no corruption, there'll be no wrong, there'll be no violence, there'll be nothing going on like that. Can you imagine just for a moment what life would be like? And you want to talk about prosperity? Brother, that's prosperity, isn't it? So the psalm, again, here very briefly today, is emphasizing that we could pray for our leaders to be just. And the leaders, there'd be something else if the leaders were making that prayer themselves, that they would be just before God, they would do righteousness, they would do what was right regardless of what the political agendas were, that the politicians were statesmen, they care about the nation, they care about the people, and they're not overwhelmed about themselves. And that would make a great nation, I believe, don't you? And so look at the Psalm 72. It brings out a lot of good things, and I think that it would be helpful, don't you? Boy, this might be something that ought to be read sometimes, even in inaugurations. Psalm chapter 72. And we'll be looking at Psalm chapter 73 tomorrow.